which allowed us to reach a wider audience than ever before. We expanded our popular Burke to Buckley program, a seminar which teaches the foundations of conservative thought to mid-career professionals, to include a virtual course open to anyone intellectually curious about the principles behind our movement. We started hosting monthly book and movie club calls, which provide a way for our donors to engage with each other on interesting topics from wherever they are in the world. And this coming May 20th and 21st, remote guests will be invited to tune into a live stream of our biennial Ideas Summit, featuring panel discussions with notable conservatives and top NR writers discussing important issues of today. One more quick plug before we get into today's event. It's been about a year since our launch of National Review Capital Matters, our bold new effort to explain, defend, and celebrate capitalism. And it has proven to be an indispensable resource for those seeking robust financial coverage from a free market perspective in what we call an NR sensibility. Capital Matters' new podcast, titled The Capital Record, sponsored by NRI and hosted by NRI trustee David Bahnsen, provides a new way to promote our unabashedly free market ideas to a larger audience than ever before. You can learn about all of those programming and events by visiting nrinstitute.org. Now back to today's event. One of the ways that we connect NR writers to readers is through regional partnership events like this one today. These events serve two valuable purposes. One, to amplify the work of NR writers beyond the pages of the magazine. And two, to support many of the allied state-based organizations across the country. And we're pleased to partner with one of those fantastic groups today in the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. I myself am based in Milwaukee, so it's of course my very favorite state-based think tank. To tell us a little bit more about Will is Director of External Relations, Eric Searing. Eric?
Thank you, Chris. First off, I want to say it is our pleasure, as always, to team up with our friends at the National Review Institute. And I want to thank everyone who made time for us today for what we think, what we know will be an excellent discussion. For those that aren't familiar with the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, we were founded 10 years ago, right here in Milwaukee, by our President and General Counsel, Rick Esenberg. And under Rick's leadership, we've become one of the fastest growing state-based litigation and policy centers in the country. Through litigation, education, and participation in public discourse, Will advances the public interest in the rule of law, individual liberty, constitutional government, and a robust civil society. Recently, we launched our own election integrity project here at Will, which I'm sure Rick will discuss in more detail in today's program. Our goal for this project is simple. We want to take a closer look at how the elections were conducted this past November, inform the public of our findings, and work with policymakers on finding solutions aimed at addressing any vulnerabilities we might discover in that analysis, and to restore confidence in the outcomes of our election. Once again, thank you all for joining us. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Eric. Eric, do you all have a website that people can visit for more information?
Absolutely. It's www.will-law.org.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Now, turning back to today's topic, election integrity, are the aforementioned Rick Esenberg, founder and president and general counsel of Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, and Andy McCarthy. Andy McCarthy is a best-selling author and contributor to National Review, a Fox News contributor and senior fellow at National Review Institute. Andy is the former chief assistant U.S. attorney of the Southern District of New York, who led the prosecution of the Blind Sheik for terrorism against the United States, including the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Most recently, he's authored A Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency, and host of the McCarthy Report, National Review podcast. I think behind you, we can see one of those books that we just mentioned. And Rick, like I said, is founder and president of general counsel of Will. Will has grown into one of the more active state-based think tanks and litigation centers around the country. He's a frequent litigator in state and federal courts and nationally recognized scholar and commentator on constitutional law, particularly the First Amendment's guarantees of freedom of speech and religion. Rick, Andy, take it away.
Well, thanks, Chris. It's always great to do an event with National Review. I think I've been a subscriber for National Review to National Review for longer than Chris and Eric have been alive, and it's always a special treat. On a personal note, I'm also very happy to give Andy an opportunity to talk about something other than Derek Chauvin. But I will note, and I would be remiss if I didn't, that his reporting on that trial has been among the best that I've read. And that isn't only because I almost always agree with it. I mean, it really has been excellent and even-handed and very legally astute. I want to start in our discussion about election integrity with a bit of a disclaimer, and perhaps one that some of my Republican friends will not want to hear. At its heart, election integrity is less a crusade than it is a sober assessment of the trade-off between asking voters to follow a set of rules that represent reasonable safeguards of the integrity and even-handedness of the process, and avoiding unnecessary obstacles to the exercise of the franchise. Striking this sober balance is not served by unsubstantiated speculation and claims about fraud and stolen elections that are not predicated in fact. This type of speculation, these type of allegations do more harm to the cause of election integrity than the Democrats ever could accomplish. And so I think one of the things I want to start with is the notion that we need to take an even-handed and evidence-based assessment of where the problems are and where the problems aren't, because the problems are very real. The Democrats in particular are pursuing an ideologically driven view that there is really no trade-off at all, that voting rules must be crafted so as to require almost no effort at all on the part of voters, so that almost any election integrity effort is denounced as voter suppression. This view is rooted, or at least defended, by an assertion that even the slightest requirement imposed on voters will deter them from voting, and an assumption that those who are most likely to be deterred from voting are likely to vote Democratic. This in turn is married to the notion that it is always more difficult for poor and socially disadvantaged people to do anything. And so asking poor and socially disadvantaged voters to do something in order to vote puts them at a disadvantage. And as is so often the argument that we hear today, because poor and socially disadvantaged persons are disproportionately minority, then any effort at voter integrity is racist and in violation of the Voting Rights Act. From a legal perspective, this has the very untoward consequence of turning voting rules into a one-way ratchet. That once we make something, once we suspend a requirement, as we did in the context of the pandemic, that we may never go back, because going back requires someone to do something with respect to registration, with respect to proving that they are who they are and that they live where they say they live. And if this can be cast as having a disproportionate impact on minority groups, then it's a violation of the Voting Rights Act. As you can imagine, this makes voting integrity measures very, very difficult, because the nature of them is that they require voters to do something, right? We must register to vote. We must prove that we are who we say we are, that we live where we say we live. We must vote during a particular period of time. We must vote in a way in which our vote can be validated and counted. All election integrity efforts will require some type of effort. As I said before, this is a balance. The Democrats seem to be denying that this balance is necessary. This view, I think, is further substantiated by a claim that fraud simply does not happen. And this claim is about as near to absolute as it can be. We hear it repeated constantly. There is no fraud. There is no evidence of fraud. Now, in my view, this is theoretically implausible. We live in a fallen world where some human beings will cheat in almost all walks of life. They will cheat on their taxes. They will cheat on their spouses. They will cheat at work. They will cheat in business. They will cheat at games. Now, most people, most of the time, will not do this, but we know that there's always some type of risk for untoward behavior. It's not clear why voting should be any different, particularly during a period in which elections are increasingly seen as existential. Right? We hear this talk about Flight 93 elections. We hear celebrities threatening to leave the country if the wrong candidate is elected. Now, they never actually leave, but they say they're going to. And so we care very deeply about this outcome. The argument we hear is that, well, even though we care much about elections, wholesale fraud is something that we shouldn't expect to happen, because engaging in wholesale fraud, moving tens of thousands of votes, for example, is very difficult without being detected. And while retail fraud is much easier, like individual people can cheat. Right? This has been my contention for a long time, that here in the state of Wisconsin, if you are careful about it, any individual could probably vote 4 or 5 times on election day through the same day registration vehicle. And as long as they were careful, the chances of being caught are almost nil. But that not a lot of people will do that. And so most elections are beyond the margin of fraud. The problem, it seems to me, is that this argument that wholesale fraud is likely to be detected presupposes the very thing that the Democrats are continually attacking. That is, it presupposes some system for detecting and preventing fraud. And to the extent that we systematically do away with these, we don't require people to prove who they are. We don't require people to prove that they live where they do. We don't require registration rolls to be accurate. We move to absentee and mail voting, which takes place outside the supervision of election officials. This predicate proposition that there's unlikely to be wholesale fraud becomes more and more problematic. In addition to that, it's inconsistent with what we know. Right, we know that there is fraud. Right, we know, for example, that just recently a congressional election in North Carolina was set aside because of violations of rules against ballot harvesting. We know that earlier in 2020, elections in New Jersey were set aside because of abuse of absentee voting. And in fact, there are some historians, including Robert Carroll, who believe that a former president of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, won his first election to the United States Senate in Texas in 1948 on the basis of verified voter fraud. So we know that this is likely to happen, and it's our contention that whether or not you think that the 2020 election was stolen or marred by fraud, I've not seen evidence that it was stolen or marred by fraud, but whether or not you think that's true or not, that this sober trade-off is nevertheless one that we're faced with. So we now have, I think, 2 competing views. The Republicans currently are most concerned about the move towards absentee voting, which, as I said before, happens outside the supervision of voting officials, which if that doesn't require moving or minimizing absentee voting, it at least requires some safeguards which might not otherwise be in place. Now, the fact that this is so often dismissed by our friends on the left is something that I find a bit ironic, because when we were going through the voter ID battle, one of the arguments that we consistently heard was that voter ID is not necessary to prevent fraud because a sophisticated fraudster would not take aim at in-person election day voting. He or she would take aim at absentee voting because that's far easier to manipulate. And one of the things that happened in the 2020 cycle is that we moved away, in part in response to the pandemic, perhaps some of it was justified, some were not, from traditional safeguards on absentee voting. And so if you look at the post-2020 election litigation, at least that which was most meritorious, Wisconsin is an example of this. The argument by the Trump campaign, which I thought had some merit, and as opposed to the case brought by Sidney Powell and her affiliates that did not, was that Wisconsin had departed from certain rules regarding the casting of absentee ballots, that it wasn't so much that improper votes had been cast, but that votes had been cast improperly. So there were arguments about whether or not the use of drop boxes was unlawful. There were arguments about whether or not you could have an alternate polling site that does not appear to have been authorized by statute. That is the much remarked upon voting in parks in the city of Madison. It had to do with failure to require persons requesting an absentee ballot to submit voter ID by telling them that they could simply claim that they were indefinitely confined and therefore were not required to do so. It had to do with the correction of witness signatures by clerks. And these issues, excuse me, remain unresolved in the state of Wisconsin. But they and similar issues, such as when ballots have to be received, are sort of at the heart of GOP efforts at reform, which tend to happen on a state-by-state basis. The Democrats have taken a much different approach, sort of a top-down centralized approach, where they propose to essentially federalize our elections by specifying the manner in which states must conduct them in a far more particularized and detailed degree than has historically been the case, and which may very well violate constitutional grants of authority to the states to determine how presidential elections presidential electors are chosen, and to determine the time and manner of selecting legislators, that is representatives to the House and United States senators. There are some provisions in the law which may very well violate the First Amendment, sort of an expansion of electioneering communications, the definition of that, and an application of that to groups that hither, would not have been covered before. That raises First Amendment concerns. But the extraordinary thing in the context of election integrity is that, HR 1, the For the People Act, does some really extraordinary things. It mandates automatic voting registration. It mandates no fault absentee voting. By then, it means that you don't have to have a reason that you're voting absentee. Most states have that today, but not all of them do. It mandates online registration, drop boxes, same-day registration, which we have in Wisconsin, and which presents certain problems and opportunities for misbehavior, which to some extent have been abetted by the voter ID requirement, which we adopted about 10 years ago. This HR 1 mandates late receipt of ballots. It mandates ballot harvesting and actually forbids limits on the number of persons who can turn in a ballot. By ballot harvesting, I mean the notion that activists go around and they request ballots on behalf of people. They collect ballots on behalf of people. and they either turn the ballots in or maybe don't turn the ballots in. It is, I have repeatedly said, an occasion of political sin to allow activists to do this type of thing at scale. It mandates voting by convicted felons who have been released from prison and severely limits the use of voter ID. It is really a radical redistribution of authority between the federal government and the state governments, and is, in my view, another example of the way in which the Biden administration is currently taking the position that having a split Senate and holding the vice presidency somehow justifies a radical transformation of the system under which we live. And so I think we can get into some of the details of this as we move forward. I've been talking long enough, and I'll turn it over to Andy.
Well, thanks so much, Rick. And on behalf of National Review, I just want to reiterate what Chris said. It's really a delight for us to be able to partner with Will. And in particular, I have to say this is the second time we've done this, and I felt like the last time I actually came away having learned more from listening to Rick than contributed to the discussion. And Rick was good enough to mention my coverage of the Chauvin case, which I appreciate. But I must say one thing that really hammered home to me in that experience is I guess since I left the practice of law, which is almost 20 years ago now, when I have followed trials and reported on them and litigation matters and reported on them, I do, for the most part, what most people do, which is I follow the press coverage. Now, having been in the system, I have a probably more intimate idea than most common people do about the kind of things that the press gets wrong in media reporting about litigation and media reporting about trials. But I have not, until this last recent trial, done what I did this time around, which was hop in and watch the trial as if I were on the jury, or at least as if I were in the courtroom every day watching things happen. And the reason I mention this is because I really think having gotten those juices flowing again for the first time in a long time, there really isn't any substitute when you're dealing with legal issues in terms of being sharp and in terms of treating them in the way they ought to be treated. There's no substitute for being in the arena and being in the active participation end of litigation, at least being close enough to watch it rather than read about it third and fourth hand. And that's why I think what Rick does is so valuable, because when he's speaking about these issues, he's not talking from the cheap seats like a lot of us are. You're actually in the arena wrestling with these issues and having, in a very sharp way, having to confront what the arguments are on the other side and the best thinking on the other side. And we always need to be mindful of that, because if we've learned anything over time, it's that we always have to be ready to check our own premises. And just because an idea comes from the other side doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad idea. Maybe usually, but certainly not necessarily. So I really appreciate being here, and I appreciate Rick's perspective. I had a number of points that I want to make, but as Rick was speaking, I want to bounce off a couple of things he said, because I think it really cuts to the heart of what we need to talk about. The end of Rick's remarks, he talked about harvesting. I have a lot of friends, loved ones, acquaintances who were ardent Trump supporters, certainly more ardent. I was a Trump supporter, but I wouldn't call myself an ardent one. But they were, particularly strong Trump supporters, and they were of a mind to believe that the election, the 2020 election, was stolen. And having closely followed the litigation, not only in Wisconsin, but in Pennsylvania and Michigan and other places where the president litigated the election, I was certainly of a mind to believe the election was not stolen. And what hit me over the head most about all of the litigation generally was that there were a number of times when the Trump campaign would say things publicly about what had gone on in the various states. And then when they came into court, they were given the opportunity to prove some of this stuff. And I think every single time that they were asked either to participate in a hearing or even to participate in a trial, they ended up folding, at least on the claims of fraud. That I have found is a difficult thing to communicate to people who were supporters of the president and who I think are much more enthralled by what they heard in the public commentary and were not inclined to really follow what was going on in the courtroom and in the litigations closely. But the one thing I've found in talking about the election with a lot of these people that actually hit home and resonated with them is the view I've come to, and I'd be interested to know what Rick thinks about this, but my view now is that the problem we have is much more with what's legal than what's illegal. So all of the litigation about the election and certainly the public commentary that was made about it proceeded from the premise that a lot of things went on that were fraudulent, a lot of things went on that were flatly illegal. And I come away thinking that the bigger problem, and I'm thinking of harvesting in particular, is what we now permit, which opens the floodgates to a lot of misconduct and sharp practices that really can't be effectively policed if you're going to allow harvesting in your system. So the one way I've actually been able to talk to people and get some kind of a consensus is on the idea that what's wrong here in this whole system is a lot more about what we allow than what was claimed in the election to have been fraudulent or unlawful. And the second thing I would say is in the nature of our fundamental understandings of what we're trying to accomplish in an election system. The left is of a mind to implement, and they're in a big hurry about it now, I think, in a way that they hadn't been before, an idea of, which would have been anathema to the framers, an idea of sort of bottom-up democracy. The framers were not fans of pure democracy, and they certainly would not have been shy about saying something that is almost heresy, it seems, if we say it out loud today, which is that there's no need for every single person to vote, which is, I don't want to be misunderstood about this. I'm not saying that there should be any impediments to people voting. And I think anybody who's qualified, we ought to make it, reasonably easy for them to participate in elections. But I don't think we should be trying to force people to vote or force the idea that we always have to be more expansive about the franchise, when in fact, it's a better society if the people who are participating in the process are people who actually care about public policy. So I think a lot of what is going wrong today has to do with the fact that we're pushing for something that is not actually helpful, which is this whole idea that like every single person, there should be a ballot for everyone and everyone should be registered and everyone should vote. There are places in the world where they would crawl over glass to exercise the franchise that we take for granted. And I don't think, with having the good fortune, having hit life's lottery to be born Americans and born in the United States, the procedures that we have for elections in order to protect the integrity of elections are not exactly daunting. We're not making people go through burdensome problems in order to exercise the right to vote. So the whole idea that you have to always be reducing the burdens that are involved here, I think is wrongheaded. And secondly, relatedly, what you see in, and I think this was especially true of Wisconsin, but not Wisconsin alone, there has been in the law in many states a pretty explicit presumption that we favor voting in person. And while we allow absentee voting, and traditionally have only allowed it when there are certain excuses that you have to actually comply with the excuses that are in state statutes. But the idea is we favor in-person voting, we disfavor absentee voting, and the implication that flows from that is that we want to make in-person voting as easy as possible, but if you're going to vote absentee, you have to comply with the statutory conditions. And if you don't do that, it's not because the conditions are too persnickety, it's because you're doing something that we don't favor. We would rather you voted in person. I think we've gotten away from that, even though the vestige of that preference, which I think is a healthy preference, is still in the law of many states. So I think if we're gonna end up arguing this from a position where we're afraid to say we really don't care if every single person votes, and in fact, we don't think you have to bend over backwards to make sure every single person votes. And if we're gonna if we're gonna be apologetic about taking the position that we would rather you voted in person than voted absentee because the latter lends itself to fraud, and that is obvious whether people want to contest it or not, then I think it's just it's a matter of time before we erode anything that we could, with our heads up, call election integrity. So I think I see this problem for conservatives in a whole array of things across the board, but I think we're too afraid to argue from first principles on this stuff. So I'll leave it at that and wonder what Rick thinks of all that.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things that are lost in this. I mean, if you think of an election as a national deliberation, and the campaign tests the candidates, it tells us something about them, how they react to it, what we learn about them as they're subject to kind of scrutiny that happens during a campaign. We are increasingly allowing people to weigh in on the outcome of that deliberative process way before it's over. I mean, we have people who are casting ballots over a month before election day, and putting aside concerns about fraud, I think there's a legitimate issue as to whether or not we ought to be doing that, because once you've cast that vote, you can't get it. Well, you can get it back technically, but at least in this state. But as a practical matter, it simply isn't going to happen. I'm intrigued. I am always intrigued by this notion that that it's important not to fetishize voting, and I think that there's a political philosophy argument that we could have as to whether or not voting is the most important right we have. I mean, there's an argument I think that can be made that if we had the Bill of Rights and nothing less, we'd be okay. If we had voting but not the Bill of Rights, we wouldn't be okay. But beyond that, even if you think that voting is the most sacred thing that we do, that implies that it should be exercised with some measure of responsibility. And as I noted earlier, there is this ideological presumption that the Democrats have, and you will see this argument made explicitly, that that voting is a low reward behavior, And so even the smallest burden that's placed by voting, and by burden, I mean having to do something, right? You have to register, you have to go at a specified time. You have to provide, something that shows you are who you are, and you live where you live. All of these things are seen as, and I think routinely described in the mainstream media as obstacles to voting. And what is left unsaid, and I'm glad that Andy said it, is that if voting is the most sacred thing we do, and if it is a very important civic duty, and I think that it is, then we ought to be willing to do some things to ensure the integrity and the even-handedness of the process. And when we're not willing to do this, we probably also aren't willing to inform ourselves about the vote that we're casting. And so I think this idea that the only thing that matters is the turnout rate is dangerous because it reflects an incomplete and immature understanding of what casting a vote entails.
Yeah, I would, along those lines, one of the things that I thought was very interesting following the election litigation, and in particular, the one consistent point I think that the Trump campaign and its allies in the litigation made, no matter where they were litigating, was that it was up to the state legislatures, not other government actors, to prescribe the conditions under which, the rules under which voting took place. And what's very interesting about that, and this goes to Rick's point about how important this all is. If you go to the Constitution, you have a right to free speech, you have a right to privacy, you have all kinds of rights that are spelled out in the Bill of Rights and in the structure of the Constitution, as Rick just described. What you won't find is a right to vote. In point of fact, and a number of the cases say this, some of the Supreme Court cases say this, the right to vote in federal elections is conferred by state legislatures on the population in the states. So the framers looking at this certainly didn't think that there was a fundamental right to vote. That doesn't mean the right to vote is obviously important. It's got a lot of pedigree to it, obviously, and if a state affords it, which every state, of course, has, it's got to be respected, and it's a very important right. But the idea that it's fundamental is simply not the case, at least in this system. And I guess along the lines of the currents of the litigation, I did want to ask Rick, because I see already that we're going to run short on time, but I want to make sure he gets a chance to address this. Justice Thomas wrote an opinion in one of these cases. I think it was the last one I saw in connection with the various litigations that arose out of the election, where one of the things he thought was particularly important was the need for especially the Supreme Court to address these election claims prior to elections taking place, because as a practical matter, the amount of time that you have to litigate the kinds of claims that arise post-election, the time frame for it is just so crimped, and the need to get discovery with the clock ticking in these tight time frames is so impractical that it's irresponsible for the courts not to turn to these issues before the elections happen, because you really can't address them very effectively afterwards. What do you think of that, Red?
Yeah, I mean, so the litigation that was brought by the Trump campaign, and the Trump campaign was represented by a lawyer named Jim Trupis, who's been doing this forever and is a very, very good lawyer. And the claims that were made, again, were that not so much that improper votes had been cast, but that votes had been cast improperly. And because absentee balloting is a we do have a constitutional right to vote in the state of Wisconsin, but in our constitution, but absentee balloting is clearly made a privilege under the statute. And they recite that the requisites for absentee voting have to be assiduously followed. And so there was this argument. There were four arguments that basically that there had been problems. We didn't have the late ballots coming in issue in Wisconsin because although the federal district court had purported to did enter an order requiring those votes to be counted, that was very promptly reversed by the higher courts. So this is the argument that the Trump administration was making, and a majority of the Wisconsin Supreme Court held that it was too late, basically, to make these arguments. These arguments should have been made prior to the election, and were now barred by the doctrine of laches. Now, whether we think that's true or not as a legal matter, it has some fireside equity because at least in some of these cases, clerks had told people that this is the way that you can vote. And the prospect of deciding after the fact that you actually can't vote that way and the results of the election have to be invalidated because of that is a very, very heavy lift. If I'm entitled to a point of personal privilege, I will say that we did bring some election-related litigation last year. We weren't involved in any of the post-election litigation, but we brought a case because we felt that the Wisconsin Election Commission had an obligation to clean up the voter rolls and wasn't doing it by removing people who had been identified as movers and didn't respond to a postcard saying, look, it looks like you've moved, you can't continue to vote at your old address. Now, I'm doing a thing that a lawyer usually doesn't do. I'm bringing up a case that we didn't win. Normally, we don't like to talk about cases that we didn't win, but the point is not whether we were right or wrong. I respectfully think we were right for reasons that I won't get into here, but a majority of the court disagreed. But we intentionally brought that case in October of 2019 because we understood exactly the dynamic that you're talking about. You can't go in at the last minute. I mean, this stresses courts in a way that litigators typically like to avoid. And but we didn't get that decision until 2 weeks ago. And so I absolutely agree with Justice Thomas. I'm very sympathetic to the concerns that a majority of the Wisconsin Supreme Court had in the Trump versus Biden litigation. But I would just like to respectfully suggest that this imposes duties on both litigators and courts. And that is, if these issues arise, the cases need to get filed well in advance, and the cases need to get decided in advance so that when going to the election, we know what the rules are.
Yep. Chris, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, unless you wanted to respond to that or if you had any final comments there.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to ask Rick, having looked at the at Wisconsin, one of the last things I wrote about this was that I was pretty confident looking at the opinions of the court that Biden had won the election in Wisconsin, but it sure seemed like it was a lot closer than, was it 22,000 votes? Was that I think at that point in time was either 22 or I think it was 22,000 was the margin we were talking about. And in particular, it looked like, and I'd be interested in your take on this. It looked to me like the voting in the park, and specifically whether the ballots were actually turned over to someone who, under the law of Wisconsin, had the authority to be the custodian of them. That seemed like a pretty black and white violation of law. And if that's true, I don't think, the way I understood the raw numbers, there weren't enough votes that it would have changed the election. But if you were to invalidate those votes, it would have been a lot tighter in Wisconsin than people are led to think.
Yeah, I think that's right. There was this sort of voting in the park thing, which became very infamous in that it was more or less announced by the Biden campaign that this was happening, and so they had voting, I think, in sort of 200 city parks, and there were a lot of concerns about ballot security. I, for example, was told what the password was to get votes handed to you the day before the event actually took place, and which suggests that perhaps security wasn't the best. And there were some legal arguments as to whether or not this was a properly designated alternate polling place, whether it was staffed in the right way. It would not have changed the election. I think to get to 22,000, this is why they had to have a series of arguments, three of which I think were pretty good. One of them, I think, was less good. It was essentially an argument that we had been doing. Or we don't really, technically, we don't have early voting. We have early absentee voting, and then we had been doing this improperly for years, and such that, you know, the lawyer for the Trump campaign was essentially making the argument that his own vote was invalid because it had been cast improperly, because my vote would have been too. So, but I think it was, I think Wisconsin probably was closer than the 22,000 suggests, but 22,000 is a lot of votes to move by litigation.
Yep.
All right, thank you, gentlemen, for the very good conversation. I think we could probably go for another hour if we wanted to, but we do have some questions. Some are legal and some are more kind of your own thoughts on different things. The first one, and you both alluded to it on the onset, is the perception of fairness in elections, not necessarily the level of integrity, but the perception of integrity. Are there things that the states or election commissions can do to restore confidence in the process?
I don't know that. I mean, this is a problem I would have not just with the elections, but this is a more across the board global problem. We're proceeding on a lot of misinformation. I mean, you know, the idea that to restore. So, I mean, the way the game works is you have people who want to alter the process because they think it'll work better for them if they do. So they peddle a lot of misinformation about a process, and then complain that there are now public concerns raised that call into question the integrity of the process, when in fact they haven't actually, you know, established that we have, you know, grave reason to be worried about the process. You know, I think we want to have voting integrity, and if that's what you're worried about, we should be unapologetic about a preference for people to vote in person. And if we're not willing to do that, then I just don't see how it doesn't erode over time.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always say to my friends on the left, and I still have a few, is that rightly or wrongly, conservatives and Republicans are quite sincerely concerned about election fraud. And I assume that people on the left, at least some of them, are quite sincerely concerned about putting unnecessary obstacles in the way of voting, which is why I started by saying that this really is about trade-offs. And I think that when we do things like what happened with the reforms in Georgia, where, you know, I said Republicans had made some exaggerated claims of fraud, which I think harmed the cause of election integrity after the 2020 election. I think that the Democrats similarly squandered credibility by seriously suggesting that it's Jim Crow if we have only 15 days of early voting instead of 21. I mean, the only way that you can make that statement with a straight face is if you've never heard of Jim Crow and know nothing about it. That may fool the guys that run Major League Baseball and Coca-Cola, but it doesn't fool anybody else. I mean, it doesn't really even fool them either. I mean, that was a play for market, but it doesn't fool anybody else. And so we need to reach some type of a balance so that we go back to the notion that we're not two countries, that we're involved in the same process. We're electing a candidate pursuant to rules that, yes, they require us to do some things, but it's not unreasonable at all. That we routinely do things every day that are not as hard. I often tell the story. Years ago, I was sort of a regular at a weekly radio panel on an African American station. I was kind of their wingnut in residence, and we had a conversation in a commercial break, and there was a white college professor who was going on and on about how voter ID was voter suppression and anti-minority. And the host of the show, who was an African American, said, you've been in this building and you've seen that everybody who works here is Black. And the professor says, yes. And he says, they all have photo identification. And the professor said, well, that's because they're middle class. And the host of the show said, oh no, I see their paycheck. They're not middle class. But yet they have photo ID. And so I think part of what the Democrats often do here is they infantilize, people to create the perception of a problem that simply doesn't exist.
Might do a little bit of rapid fire here because we're coming up at the hour mark. Similar to the HR 1 bill being proposed, do you, in your crystal balls, do you think voting laws will continue to become more federalized?
I think in this administration, everything's going to become more federalized. We're just about to see as a result of George Floyd, there is a big push on the the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which is basically an effort to federalize policing in the United States. So, if you have a progressive administration and you're in a big hurry to transform the society, the easiest way to do that is to federalize it so that it's a one size fits all. That's what HR 1 is about. And that's what a lot of at least the efforts at legislation are going to be about the next couple of years.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's ironic, we sort of routinely talk about red and blue America as if they're two different places. One solution to that would be federalism, to allow, states to have greater ability to set their own policies. The side that we don't talk about as much is the fact that there is red and blue America. Sort of means that one side often can't stand what the other side is doing and feels compelled to stop them in some way. And I think we're seeing that with a vengeance right now with the Biden administration. And I think it's going to be, in many respects, the battle of the next 4 years.
Chris Hanks asks, with all of the checking, recounts, post-election reviews that were done, doesn't the 2020 election prove, or at least suggest, that the relaxation of the rules you both expressed some concern about did not actually, in fact, affect the integrity of the election? In essence, solving a problem that does not empirically exist.
Well, it depends what you mean by a problem that does not empirically exist. The unstated premise there is that it's not a problem if it couldn't have changed the outcome of the election.
Right.
And that's only true with respect to any one particular election, right? I think that it's safe to say that Joe Biden won enough states beyond the margin of any potential fraud so that we can be confident that Joe Biden really won the election. But you can imagine a different set of circumstances where that's not true. And the 2000 election is probably the quintessential example where the election came down to one state. It was Florida, and there were not so much allegations about fraud there, but allegations about how the ballots were counted. And I got to tell you, I used to teach election law, and the New York Times had an interactive website that where you could specify your rules for how you were going to count. Were you going to count hanging chads and dimpled chads? You remember chads were a thing back then. And there's one scenario in which George Bush won the state of Florida by 2 votes. 2 votes, became president of the United States. And so we can't assume that all elections are going to be beyond the margin of fraud.
I agree with that.
Any thoughts on why the Supreme Court did not take up the Pennsylvania case? I believe they thought it was moot, but any thoughts on the Supreme Court not taking up Pennsylvania?
I would like to address this. Maybe this is my theme for today, but in the context of a broader problem. I think that you have a very risk-averse Supreme Court, which is not becoming less risk-averse with all of the rhetoric and the proposals and the commissions and the proposed legislation about packing the court, which I don't think the people who are proponents of it have any realistic idea that they're going to pack the court, but they do think it has an intimidating effect on the court, and there's certainly precedent for that. One of the stories we like to tell ourselves is that FDR's court packing effort in 1937 was a phenomenal flop, and at the height of his power, with great command over both houses of Congress and the Democratic Party, he wasn't able to get it done. Well, that may be true legislatively, but the fact of the matter is the Supreme Court did change its jurisprudence, and it did feel the heat, and it is feeling it today. So I think it's not just, it's understandable, especially after the Bush v. Gore, all of the coverage and the rhetoric that came out of that the Supreme Court does not want to be in a position of deciding elections, which, as we were talking about before, is a good reason why they should take these cases before the election rather than after and decide them. But I think this Supreme Court doesn't want to get involved in a lot of stuff.
Yeah, as we had the famous switch in time that saved 9. The irony of all of that is that if the public perceives you as pulling your punches in order to avoid criticism, that undermines confidence in the court. And I think that a lot of times what the Chief Justice in particular has tried to do is backfired on him.
Rick, Andy, thank you so much. We're exactly at 1 o'clock Central, so we are going to wrap up. Thank you both for your time. Thank you, Will, for partnering with National Review Institute again. I hope we will have the occasion to do it again very soon, maybe in person.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone, for calling in today and listening in. And like I said, we very much appreciate you tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you again very soon. Andy and Rick and everyone on the call, thank you so much.
Thank you.